Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Modern Indian History we will be talking about Introduction to History of India from 1857 to 1950. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Manoj Sharma. Dr. Sharma is Assistant Professor in Department of History in Kirorimal College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
Very good afternoon to all the viewers. Today's topic of discussion is the introduction to the history of India from 1857 to 1950. As we all know that this particular period of history, in which first we see the revolt of 1857 and thereafter the rise of the national movement from 1885 onwards with the establishment of the Indian National Congress. So this period is one of the most important and significant periods in the Indian history. What we also do in this particular kind of study as these kind of courses which are being designed to study the period, basically the kind of topics which are being generally discussed is the social-religious reform movements as well. Though the origin of the social-religious reform movements is in the first half of the 19th century, but they are being also discussed because they carry on in the later part of the 19th century as well. And we refer to them as social-religious reform movements because the society and the religion during that particular period, they were linked in such a way that any kind of social reform was not possible if reforms in religion could not be brought about. And the social-religious reform movements, they centered on generally two issues. One of the important issues was the caste system, and the other important issue was the emancipation of women. So what we see during this particular period is that a number of religious reformers, they got associated with various issues which were related to women. For example, they talked about the abolition of sati, they talked about how widow remarriage that should take place. They were also talking about the issues of women emancipation in the context that more and more education should be provided to the women. So what we see is that all these kind of issues which were related to the women, how they were important in this context, that how society wanted to transform the kind of problems which were existing from the earlier times. And this becomes more important in the context that British, those who had come to India, they were also bringing about a number of aspects. For example, the ideas of rationalism and humanism, they were also being discussed during that particular period. So the social religious reform movements during the initial part of the 19th century and thereafter, they became significant from this perspective. What we also see during this particular period was the emergence of the national consciousness as well, that how the national consciousness which emerged during this particular period also contributed to the national movement as well. So from this perspective, social-religious reform movements, they became very, very important. And the kind of issues which these movements, they discussed in the context of women, for example, they were talking about women's education, they were talking about female infanticide, they were also talking about the issue of polygamy. So all these kind of aspects, they were being discussed in all these kind of movements during this particular period. What we also see in these movements, that kind of awakening which they caused during that particular moment as well, because the people, those who were associated with the socio-religious reform movements, they also realized that unless they will be awakened by the ideas of rationalism and humanism, the kind of evils of the society, they will not go away. And at the same time, they were also connected with the issue of culture and heritage as well, as we see during this particular period that some kind of the movement brought some kind of an intellectual and cultural break which made a vision of the future possible. And at the same time, it was a part of the resistance against the colonial cultural and ideological hegemony. So all these kind of movements, they became quite significant during that particular period. What we also see during this particular period, though this topic is generally not covered in this course, is the revolt of 1857. And the revolt of 1857, as we all know, was the first armed struggle in that way, that it was a huge struggle in which people from diverse sections, they participated, and it also shook the foundations of the East India Company or the British rule. So from that perspective, a number of factors, they were responsible for the revolt of 1857. The causes were the social, economic, cultural, religious, all such kind of causes were responsible for the revolt of 1857. And how the people of Hindustan or India, they were in a way crushed by the Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, the triumvirate in the economic spheres, the kind of economic policies which were being followed by the British during this particular period. They were bringing some kind of an economic backwardness to the country, and how the people, those who were victims of the economic policies of the British, they were suffering under the colonial rule. On the other hand, from the social or the religious perspective, the kind of intervention which was being made by the British during this particular period, it in a way caused some kind of a dissonance among the masses, as they did not want that British they should interfere in their internal matters or the social and religious matters. From the military point of view, what we see is that the soldiers, they were being denied bhattas when they were traveling to the faraway locations. On the other hand, the soldiers, they could not rise beyond the rank of subedar, how they were being ill-treated by the white soldiers, and the kind of issue of greased cartridges in which pig fat and the cow fat was being used in the new rifles which were being introduced during this particular period. And both the Hindu and the Muslim soldiers, they did not like such kind of thing in which they felt that their religion would be in danger. So this issue of greased cartridges was considered to be an immediate factor which led to the revolt of 1857. Thereafter, the importance of the revolt of 1857 could be seen in the context of the nature of the revolt of 1857, where it was being seen that revolt was, it was being shown that revolt was just a sepoy mutiny, and the nationalist historians later they claimed that it was the first war of independence, and there are others who claimed that it was a religious war, and there were others, those who considered a revolt as just some sort of a conspiracy. But what we see is that how revolt of 1857 left some kind of a legacy, and how during the national movement it was being used by the nationalists to bring some kind of a inspiration or to some sort of a roadmap, in the context that it was some sort of an inspiration for the later generations. So what we see during this particular period is that when Indians, they got defeated in the revolt of 1857, they could not secure independence from the colonial rule. Then how the divide and rule policy which was being followed by the British during this particular period led to some kind of a dissonance among the masses, and we see a number of organizations or associations, they were being formed. And with the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885, which was considered to be the phase of the moderates, and 1885 to 1907 is the phase of the moderates, and their politics was based on petition, prayer and protest, and they believed that British had some kind of sense of justice. They were liberal in their approach. This is what was felt by the moderates. And the kind of demands which they put forward, all these kind of demands were very liberal in nature. And when these kind of demands, they were being put forward so that they could be redressed by the colonial government, it showed their maturity, because these kind of demands, they were not only dealing with the kind of issues which were there in India, but at the same time the people, those who had been sent as indentured labor to other parts of the world, they were also trying to address their grievances. And one of the important contributions was the drain of wealth theory, which was given by Dadabhai Naoroji and others, and it was some sort of an economic critique of the colonial rule. So all such kind of issues which were taken up by the moderates during this particular period, they were quite significant, and how they also raised the level of discussion and debate in India. What we also see is the Swadeshi movement during this particular period. 1905 was the period when the Swadeshi movement was launched, and Swadeshi movement was talking about the issue of Swadeshi and boycott, that how we should use the Swadeshi goods and commodities, how emphasis on Swadeshi or national education was put, and how British goods and services and British education, all that was to be rejected or boycotted by the Indians. So it created some kind of a climate within the country, because of which the kind of consciousness with regard to the national movement, it was raised. And when Swadeshi and the boycott movement, it became quite popular in Bengal and other parts of India, we see a number of leaders, they also got recognition because of their contribution in this movement. And the movement was launched because British, they wanted to divide the Bengal on the basis of the division of Hindus and Muslims, that how they wanted to weaken the national movement, in which in Western Bengal we'll have more of Hindus and in Eastern Bengal we'll have more of Muslims. So it will be able to weaken the national movement in this way, and the reason was cited as the administrative efficiency or expediency. So what we see is that how the consciousness of the masses was raised from 1885 onwards, when the establishment of the Congress takes place, and how a number of issues they get prominence during this particular period. After the phase of the moderates, we find the phase of the extremists. Lal, Bal and Pal, they were considered to be the three important leaders who were associated with the extremists. And all these important leaders, for example, Gangadhar Tilak, he says that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. And they also excessively glorified the ancient heritage. So what we see during this particular period, that the extremists, they were critical of the moderates. The kind of politics which was being followed by the moderates was not acceptable to the extremists, and they felt that they have to follow a kind of politics in which they are able to force the colonial government to withdraw from India, and for that they'll have to follow an approach in which they should not be mere mendicants, they should not be mere beggars, rather their approach should be more forceful in nature. What extremists did was, in the context that they defied the nation, they considered nation to be some sort of a deity, because of which some of the Muslim elements, they got alienated from the kind of politics which they followed. Another important phase of this particular period was the period of the revolutionaries. What we see during this particular period is that how revolutionaries, they were disillusioned with the colonial or the British government, and they used violence to achieve their objectives, and how they attacked on government officials and the treasuries. Bhagat Singh and others like Rajguru, Ashfaqullah, Chandrasekhar Azad sacrificed themselves for the country. So what we see is that the role of revolutionaries during this particular period was quite significant in the context that they brought back the idea of heroism back, and they believed that British, they did not want to provide any kind of justice to the Indians, and they were always oppressive in nature, and they believed in the strength or the issue of might, that they have to seek Swaraj, they have to seek self-government through their might, and if they will be able to terrorize the British officials in some way, then it will be quite useful in that particular perspective. So British, they tried to classify these revolutionaries as terrorists, but on the other hand, if we see then these people, they were not terrorists in any way, rather they were revolutionaries and they wanted to seek some kind of independence or self-rule for the Indians. So they were some sort of a terror for the colonial government, but they were not at all a terror for the Indian people. Rather, their focus was on getting some kind of independence for the Indians, and how they wanted to eliminate the British officials, because these officials, they were all oppressive for the Indians. And at the same time, how in the 20th century or in the later part of the 20th century, we see how terrorism has got a different connotation, how it has been associated with terrorist activities. So we'll have to understand the contribution of revolutionaries in that particular context, and not from a Cambridge perspective where their focus is on the positive contribution of the British, and in seeing the role of revolutionaries in a very negative manner. After that, what we see is that when Gandhi's arrival in 1915 in India, when Gandhi comes from South Africa, he is already some sort of a celebrity, and the kind of contribution in the context that the kind of ideas of Gandhi in which he was focusing on Satya and Ahimsa, and his focus was on means and ends, that how means and ends, they should be justified. Gandhi's beliefs and practices, they also show some kind of a consistency. Gandhi's focus on satyagraha, where Gandhi is saying that one should be focused on the truth, and the ideas of passive resistance, they were also being focused by Gandhi. So what we see during this particular period is that the kind of ideals of Gandhi, the kind of methods which Gandhi brought to the national movement, they became quite significant in the Gandhian phase. And all the movements of Gandhi, for example, non-cooperation movements or civil disobedience movement or Quit India movement, which were considered to be the important movements of Gandhi, they see that Gandhi focused on truth and ahimsa, and he wanted all these kind of movements to be in a way that they are non-violent in nature. And at the same time, what we have to see is that when Gandhi comes to India in 1915, and Gandhi was considered to be some sort of a celebrity when he came to India in 1915 because the kind of work which he had already done in South Africa. So Gandhi undertakes some kind of a smaller kind of a contribution, in the sense that before going to the national scene with the arrival of the Revolt Act, when he launches the Khilafat movement thereafter, and then he launches the non-cooperation movement as well. Before that, Gandhi was involved in three smaller movements, and these smaller movements, the kind of victory which Gandhi achieves in all the three movements, provided some kind of platform to Gandhi in Indian context as well. For example, the Champaran Satyagraha, in which Gandhi got involved against the Tinkathia system for the indigo cultivation, or the Ahmedabad mill strike, in which 35 wage increase for workers was sought by Gandhi, and it was achieved as well, and the Kheda Satyagraha, where no revenue campaign was launched by Gandhi. So what we see in all the three movements, Gandhi was successful, and Gandhi's popularity, it also increased because of the kind of achievement which Gandhi could secure. And when Rowlatt Act was launched in 1919, in which it was being decided that there will be no appeal, no vakil, and no dalil, in which the people, they could be some kind of a detention for the people, or a person could be sought, and he will not have any kind of right where he could call the lawyers, and no appeal from him will be listened to. So this kind of an approach, all sorts, these kind of things, they were available to the British during the emergency times, but all such kind of things were not being imposed in normal times, and Rowlatt Act was seeking such kind of rights for the British during the normal periods as well. So all this was rejected by the people, and anti-Rowlatt protests, they could be witnessed at different times, which later led to the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. And these kind of hartals and demonstrations during that particular period, as we see, led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And when Jallianwala Bagh massacre took place, what we see during this particular period, that a number of people, they also gave away the kind of honors and titles which were being there during this particular period. And when they rejected these kind of honors and titles which they had, and they also protested in some other ways as well. Gandhi also led the Khilafat movement in 1920 because when during the Turkish, when the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire, as you can see on the screen as well, that the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire took place with the Treaty of Sevres, and when this Treaty of Sevres was signed and the Turkish Empire was dismembered, then Gandhi realized that some kind of a movement which was associated with this, for example the Khilafat movement, it was launched with the two Ali brothers, Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali, and both of them, they played an important role with Gandhi. And when this kind of a movement was launched, this movement later merged with the non-cooperation movement. And the non-cooperation movement, it aimed that how the Indians, they did not have to cooperate with Gandhi in any way. And when this kind of a non-cooperation movement was launched by Gandhi in 1920s, we see a huge participation of the masses. For example, Hindus and Muslims together, they participated in this particular movement during this particular period. And another important movement of Gandhi was the civil disobedience movement in 1930. And this civil disobedience movement in 1930 began with the Dandi March. And this Dandi March also became quite successful because it was being felt that Gandhi will not be successful, and some of the imperialist historians, some of the imperialist, the people with the imperialist mindset, they believed that Gandhi was trying to defy the salt laws, and these kind of salt laws will not make any kind of impact during that particular period. And what we see in this movement was a huge participation of women. And when women, they participated in large numbers during this particular movement got some kind of a thrust. What we also see is the Quit India movement, and in which Gandhi gave the call for do or die, and it was more violent in nature. So what we see in all the three important movements of Gandhi is that Gandhi was able to secure some kind of a mass participation, and Gandhi's movements, they were more and more concerned with the mass nationalism. And when so many people, they were able to associate with Gandhi in some way, when all sorts of people, they came to support the movement, and Gandhi was able to sustain these kind of movements for a very long period of time. As we can all very understand that all kind of movements, especially the mass movements, they cannot go on for a very long period of time, because the masses, they have some kind of a capacity to undergo all such kind of a strength, so that movements can continue. And all these kind of movements, they cannot continue for a very long period of time. And Gandhian movements, that is why we see that they are being launched for a particular period, and then they are being suspended, or they are being withdrawn, and then again these kind of movements, they were being launched. So the period is the struggle, as has been explained by Bipin Chandra, who says that this kind of a tactic which was being followed during the national movement proved to be quite successful in the context that these movements were quite successful from the perspective of the participation of the masses. Gandhi also involved himself in the constructive work, as we see in the emancipation of women, for example the village welfare, or removal of untouchability or Hindu-Muslim unity. So all these kind of issues were quite close to the heart of Gandhi, who believed that if Hindus and Muslims, they will be united, then the national movement will prosper. At the same time, he also believed that unless the issue of untouchability will be resolved, then we will not be able to secure the support of so many masses, those who are considered to be untouchables. And if we will be able to remove untouchability, then all these people will come into the mainstream, and when they will come into the mainstream, then they will also contribute in some way. Another important issue during this particular period is the issue of communalism. We see that there are 3 stages of communalism, as you can see on the screen as well, and how various associations like Muslim League, Hindu Mahasabha, they were instrumental in raising this kind of issues which were considered to be communal in nature, and how Hindi-Urdu controversy also contributed to this kind of a problem. Then the Lahore session of the Muslim League, in which demand for Pakistan was made, and then the Direct Action Day, in which we find a lot of violence. So what we see during this particular period, that a lot of communal or communal tendencies could be seen, in which it was being discussed that the interest, the third stage of communalism says that the interests of the Hindus and Muslims are antagonistic to each other, and these kind of interests were the secular interests. Secular interests were the socio-economic and the cultural interests. So what we see during this particular period, that how people they got divided on the communal lines, and when the people they got divided on the communal lines, this kind of fanning of communal passions was also done by the British, because they wanted to weaken the movement as well, and for this they followed the divide and rule policy. Another important contribution during this particular period was made by the Indian National Army, or INA, in which Subhash Chandra Bose played an important role. It was initially started by Captain Mohan Singh, and thereafter Subhash Chandra Bose, who gave the call of Dilli Chalo, or Tum Mujhe Khoon Do, Main Tumhe Azadi Dunga. So all these kind of slogans, they were being raised during this particular period, and how INA was also able to inspire the masses. What we also see during this particular period was the partition. When the partition took place in 1947, during this particular period, and with the arrival of partition, when India and Pakistan, both of them, they were being partitioned, we see a lot of displacement of masses, and how these displaced people, they were being called refugees in their own countries. So when we see this particular period, or this particular period as from 1857 onwards till 1950, during this particular period we see that how the Constitution of India, that was also being framed during this particular period, and when the Constitution came, the kind of role which was played by B.R. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly, where he was the chairman of the drafting committee. So this particular period of modern India, from 1857 onwards till 1950, is very, very important from the perspective of the national movement. It is also important from the perspective of the role of the various factions of the Congress, be it moderates, be it extremists, or the Gandhian phase, in which the issue of mass nationalism became quite important. So when we try to study all such kind of movements during the national movement, and the kind of ideas of nationalism which were generated during this particular period, this period becomes quite relevant. And at the same time, this period has a lot of scope and relevance as well. So the scope and the relevance of the national movement will be taken up in another kind of discussion. Till then, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to all the viewers. Today we will talk about the scope and relevance of the phase of 1857 to 1950, which is considered to be an important phase of the Indian national movement. Because the 1857 we witnessed the revolt of 1857, and thereafter what we have seen is that how the national movement beginning from 1885 onwards with the establishment of the Indian National Congress and how it played an important role. So how this movement of the various factions of the Congress or the various phases in which we see the moderates, for example, thereafter the extremist, and thereafter the Gandhian phase of the national movement. So all of them, they played an important role in some sort in terms of achieving independence of India. What we see during this particular period is that how the devastating impact of the colonial rule was realized during this particular period, that colonialism and imperialism, both of them, they were very devastating for the Indians, and this was being realized by the Indians, that how the colonialism and imperialism were creating some kind of a havoc on the Indian economy, and at the same time not only from the economic perspective but at the same time social and cultural aspect of the people was also affected because of the kind of rule which was being undertaken by the British. The exploitative character of the colonial rule could also be seen during this particular period when we see, as you can see on the screen as well, all these kind of issues, they were quite relevant during this particular period. And how during this particular period, national movement, it played an important role. The role of the national leaders during this particular point of time, and the achievement of a democratic society because of the role of the leaders, then the historiography of the national movement, and the portrayal of nationalist ideals in cinema. So what we see is that the national movement had a very great scope in that sense, and it is relevant from the modern times, even after India achieved independence in 1947. Thereafter, the study of national movement has a very great kind of relevance in the context that we will not be able to maintain our independence if we follow the same kind of tactics or the kind of policies which were being followed during the colonial period. So from that perspective, if we keep in mind all those kind of aspects, then only we will be able to maintain our independence. What we also see during this particular period was the role of the national leaders, that how Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, Lala Lajpat Rai, all these kind of leaders, the kind of contribution they made, not only from the perspective of the role in the Congress, but at the social level as well. And at the same time, those who were not associated with the Congress, there were other leaders, not only in the nationalist framework, but at the same time those who were working at the local levels as well. And how these leaders, those who were working at the local levels, now they were also motivate the masses so that they come in the nationalist mainstream. So all sorts of contribution by the national leaders in the national movement and thereafter in the social sphere as well was also quite significant during that particular period. And because of the efforts of such leaders, how we were able to achieve some sort of a society in which the ideals of secularism, the ideals of socialism, the ideals of a sovereign kind of a society, they were being talked about during that particular moment. And at the same time, what we see during this particular period and during the later times as well was the historiography of the national movement. When we talk about the historiography of the national movement, we see that how various schools which are associated with the national movement, the kind of judgments which they pass, the kind of analysis which they do, the kind of interpretation which they put forward about the national movement, how they try to in a way argue about the points on which they have some kind of an viewpoint, and on the other hand they want to reject the kind of viewpoint which has been given by others. So all these kind of important issues about the national movement, they could be understood within the kind of historiography which has been put forward with regard to the national movement, and at the same time how these kind of nationalist ideals they were also being exhibited in the films or the literature of that particular period as well. What we see during this particular period is the economic impact of the colonial rule. Deindustrialization was one, and how because of the policies which were being followed by the British, deindustrialization took place. Impoverishment of agriculture was another. Famines, poverty of the masses, no growth of modern industries, and deforestation, which led to the commercial forest policy. So what we see is that how colonial rule was affecting the Indian industries in every way, how it was affecting the Indian economy in every possible manner, how because of the impoverishment of agriculture we see that famines were taking place in different parts of the country, and because of the famines millions of people they died during this particular period. At the same time, people became impoverished and poor. They were not able to sustain themselves in any way because British, they were taking away all sorts of resources which were available to the natives, to their own homelands in London or Britain. So what we see during this particular period is that the kind of policies which were being followed by the British, they were leaving no stone unturned in exploitation of India in every possible way. And the kind of deforestation which was caused of the commercial forest policy by the British, it was also playing an important role in terms of the subsistence needs of the people, those who were living near the forest areas, be the tribals or the agriculturalists. So in this way, Indians, they were being exploited in every way by the British. When we see the contribution of the national movement, we see that the true character of the British rule could be seen during this particular period. When Indians, they talked about drain of wealth or the drain of wealth theory, they were suggesting that how India was drained of its wealth by the British, how millions of rupees or the resources in that monetary value, they were being taken away from India to Britain. And how Britain, they were talking about the paternalism of the Raj. And this paternalism of the Raj was so called in nature because they were not in any way paternalistic to the Indian society or community. Rather, their paternalism was so called in nature because it was there to suit the British interest in all way. How the policy of divide and rule was being followed so that Indians are not able to secure any kind of unity in India. And at the same time, we also see that how Indians, they wanted that all sorts of mass mobilization should take place, and how Gandhi and other leaders, they mobilized the masses so that some kind of a society in which egalitarian values, in which democratic aspects, they could be fulfilled. What we also see during this particular period is the realization of the guiding principles of British. As you can see on the screen as well, that the politics which was being followed by the British, it depended on pragmatism, greed, political expediency, economic self-interest, racialism and sense of superiority, and utmost oppression. So all these kind of ideas, they were the guiding principles of the British. They wanted their policies to be quite practical in nature, where they were not relying on any kind of principles. Their only principle was greed and as much as exploitation of the Indian resources, so that they are able to augment the income of the British, and at the same time they are able to garner as many resources as possible for the British. So they were all unethical in nature, but at the same time they were trying to project themselves as superior in nature. They were trying to project themselves as if they were doing some kind of an obligation for the Indians when they were ruling Indians. So the white man's burden, this kind of an idea was propagated, in which it was being suggested that Indians, they were being ruled for their own benefit by the British, and the British, they had this kind of idea propagated that Indians were barbaric or uncivilized in nature, and British had come to India to civilize them, and they will civilize them by the introduction of the modern education in English, and they will also provide them the modern means of transportation and communications. Though all these kind of services which were being provided by the British were for the benefit of the British, and even the introduction of the English was also being done so that they can, in a way, they can also involve so many Indians at the lower rungs of administration, because unless Indians, they will be trained in English, they could not be utilized at the lower administrative rungs. And when we see the role of national leaders in the context of the various leaders, for example, Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, B.R. Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, they were all talking in the context of the emergence of a progressive India. Their ideals were such that they wanted India to be self-reliant in nature, and they wanted that when India becomes independent, that then we should have such kind of a society which is more democratic, which is more secular in nature, and India will be able to realize its own potential only when it will become independent. So all these kind of important aspects which were related to the national movement, the kind of contribution which was made by the leaders, they were quite relevant. It had a lot of scope in terms of understanding the true nature of the colonial rule, and at the same time the actual contribution which was made by these leaders would also be understood when we try to assess them within the context of the nature of the colonial rule. When we try to understand the national movement during this particular period, we see that a number of schools, they have tried to study the national movement. For example, Cambridge School, the historians, those who are associated with this school, they deny the basic contradiction between the interest of the Indian people and the colonialism. They deny the causative role of this contradiction in the rise of national movement. They refer to the national movement as a mimic warfare or a mock battle. They see the absence of colonialism as a socio-economic, political, cultural structure, and only see it as a foreign rule, and the struggle for power between various sections. So what we see is that the Cambridge School denies that there was an existence of the national movement at all, and if such kind of a movement existed, it was only in the context that diverse sections of the society, they were fighting amongst each other for their own benefits. And this kind of a school, for example, Cambridge School which we are talking about, it did not see that colonialism existed in India as a structure. The kind of inroads which were made by colonialism in socio-economic, political, cultural aspects was denied by them, and the kind of conflict which was there between colonialism and the Indian interest was denied by this school. They see that it was just merely some kind of a foreign rule, and this was rejected by other schools, for example the nationalist school, and they also denied or saw some kind of they did not see any kind of contradiction in that context, that how the colonial rule was leading to the national movement, because they did not consider India as a nation. They refused to consider India as a nation. They just saw India as some sort of that how factions in different sectors in India, they were trying to get control over some kind of a leadership of a movement which they initiated against the British. So what they see is that how elite groups of the Indians, they were trying to control the national movement or a movement against the British. So their perspectives, they rely on such kind of accounts where they deny India as a nation, where they reject Indian history from the perspective of the national movement. And one of the historians, Anil Seal, who is associated with the Cambridge School, he sees the national movement as representative of some sort of a struggle of one elite group against another for the British favours. They say that both the groups or the different groups of the elites, they were fighting amongst each other so that they are able to secure some kind of support from the colonial government. Another important school was the nationalist school, as you can see on the screen as well. They realized the exploitative character of colonialism, and they said that it was a result of the spread and realization of the idea of nationalism or liberty. They also said that it was a movement of the people. Their weakness was that they underplay or ignore the inherent or the inner contradictions of the Indian society. So nationalist school realized the character of colonialism, that it wanted to exploit the Indians in every possible way. They also say that it was the movement of the masses, because the masses, they aligned with the movement in every possible way, and masses, they were also quite aware that they wanted to secure independence for their own country. On the other hand, one of the other schools is the Marxist school. Marxist school, they study the contradictions between the Indian people and the colonialism, and they see the India becoming some sort of a nation. India becoming the process of the nation in the making was also realized by them. They say that the process of nation in the making was quite there. They take note of the inner contradictions of the Indian society, and their weakness was that they were not able to fully integrate their treatment of primary anti-imperialist contradiction and secondary inner contradictions, and tend to counterpose anti-imperialist struggle to class or social struggle. So what we see is that on the one hand they realize the contradictions, but at the same time their weaknesses were also there, that they were not able to integrate in such a way that as you saw on the screen as well, that they had a viewpoint in which they saw the national movement in this particular perspective. And thirdly, when we see is that they tend to see movement as a structured bourgeoisie movement and miss its open-ended and all-class character. So that the national movement was open-ended in nature, but they see it as a structured bourgeoisie movement. So this was one of the weaknesses, that the all-class character of the national movement was not seen by them. And then they tend to equate or conflate the national leadership with bourgeoisie or capitalist class. This was another important aspect which was associated with the Marxist. Another important school was the subaltern school. Subaltern school basically was a school which was dealing with the history from below. History from below means that they wanted to read history from below, how the subordinate classes, which are referred to as the subaltern classes, subaltern in the context that they are being subordinated in their position, and how their history was an important history, how their history should also be read. These people, they had all kinds of consciousness. This should also be realized, as has been suggested by the subaltern school. They want to study the autonomous domain of the subaltern consciousness, where they assign that whoever is subordinate in class, in context of gender, office or caste, their history should also be understood. And they also said that the study of the subaltern was premeditated and it had a consciousness, and this consciousness was opposed to spontaneity. So subaltern, they study the basic contradiction in the Indian society, and this contradiction was between elites which were both Indian and foreign on the one hand, and subaltern group on the another. Two distinct movements they existed: real anti-imperialist movement stream of the subalterns and the bogus national movement of the elite. This is what they argue. So this argument that movement was divided into two groups, in which there was one elite movement and there was another which was the real movement of the subordinate classes or the subaltern, was being propagated by the subaltern school. It had a number of weaknesses as well, because it some sort of a disturbing resemblance to the imperialist or the neo-imperialist characterization could be seen in this particular movement. Secondly, another weakness of this movement, as has been talked about by Bipin Chandra, is that they divide the movement into two and then accept the neo-imperialist characterization for the elite stream. Thirdly, generally ahistorical glorification of all forms of popular militancy and consciousness, and equally ahistorical contempt for all forms of initiative and activity by intelligentsia, organized party leadership and elites. So what we see is that this particular group or the subaltern group is talking about all kinds of aspects in which some sort of a neo-imperialist characterization of the movement is being done. And when one assigns that the popular stream had more consciousness and the other stream of the movement, which was elitist in nature, they had their own selfish interest, it in a way disregards the kind of movement which was led by the people, those who were associated with the national movement. So all such kind of arguments which have been put forward by subalterns, they have been rejected by others as well. And when we try to assess the national movement, we see that there was some kind of fundamental contradiction between the Indian people and British colonialism. And national leaders, they evolved a clear-cut anti-colonial ideology on which they based the national movement, and they played a pivotal role by which Indian people got formed into a nation. And the objective and the function of the movement was to promote growing unity of the Indian people through a common struggle against colonialism. So this could be seen that the objective and the function of the movement was to grow the unity of the people, and how from different platforms people, they should come on a single platform for the common struggle against the colonialism. So that was the objective and the function of the movement. What we also see is that when all this kind of a movement which was being led during that particular period, it find resonances in the cultural sphere as well. The literature of that particular period, the cinema of that particular period also finds mention of all these kind of aspects of the national movement. The ideals of the national movement, they see reflection in the literature of that particular period. The people, those who were writing during that particular period, a number of novels, number of short stories, they were also dealing with those particular aspects of the national movement. A number of films which were made during this particular period in the various genres, for example, mythologicals or socials, stunt films, popular masala films, or the realist cinema. All such kind of films which were made during this particular period, they were in a way trying to see the national movement. They were trying to interpret the national movement in their own way, and the kind of impact they created on the masses during this particular period was also associated with the national movement. When you try to see the impact, for example, we see that women, they went to theaters to see the mythologicals during this particular period, and how the newsreels of the national leaders which were being shown in the cinema halls, how cinema was used as a new audio visual source of writing history, how the portrayal of nationalist aspirations and motives in cinema could be seen during this particular period, how use of cinema by the national leaders in elections was also done, how assessment of the British censorship policy, which was political, arbitrary and oppressive, was also done. So what we see is that if national movement was not all that relevant, if it had not affected all sections of society, then how the ideals of the national movement could find some kind of a resonance in everyday life of the people, how so many people they got associated with almost all movements. And when we see the non-cooperation movement, when we see the civil disobedience movement in which thousands of people they went to prisons voluntarily, when thousands of people they participated in the movement in a very non-violent way. So if they did not feel associated with the movement in any way, all sorts of people, all sections of the society, how they participated in the movement, that was not possible. And how various streams of arts, they could also find the issues which were relevant to the national movement in their own way, how they got portrayed in literature, how they got portrayed in cinema or in art, for example, where Abhinandannath Tagore or Nandalal Bose, all these people, those who got associated with a new kind of art which was against the colonial traditions of art, which was quite there in the 20th century when India was fighting against the colonial rule. And at the same time, when we try to see this kind of a contribution in the framing of the constitution as well, the preamble says that India is a sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic. So the Constitution of India, in which B.R. Ambedkar played an important role in the drafting of the constitution, where the fundamental rights, directive principles of the state policy, which are talking about the rights of the individuals, they are talking about the progression of the society in which all the aspirations of the peoples they should be met. So they are being talked about in that fashion. And at the same time, the universal suffrage which was being given to the Indians, in which they can vote irrespective of any kind of distinctions. If they achieve a particular age, then they are being given the universal suffrage. So all those kind of aspects which were being given to us by the Constitution of India, it became only possible because the ideals of the national movement, they were dealing with such kind of aspects where they were demanding Swaraj or self-rule, where they were demanding that India should have a society which is secular in nature, India should have a society which is democratic, India should have a society which is socialist. So all these kind of notions which were already there during the national movement, they got reflected in our Indian constitution as well. And later we see that how when India became independent, then we have a mixed economy in which the private and the public sector, both of them, they are participating. The kind of scientific and the technological developments which are taking place, where IITs, space programs, IIMs, then Green Revolution which took place from 1969 onwards, liberalization and the globalization of the economy in 1990s, and India's race to become a superpower. And this kind of journey, it continues. So what we see is that even after independence from 1950 onwards, we see a lot of contribution by the Indian leaders, a lot of contribution by the people themselves in finding a feat at the world level, because unless they will make some kind of a growth in engineering, in administration, in business atmosphere, they will not be able to achieve the economic, social, political objectives which call for an egalitarian society, which call for the progress and the development of the country. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank Sir for this very enriching discussion, and I hope, dear friends, you have come to understand and appreciate what the history of modern India is all about. On that note, thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.